They called them Torre della Castità, the Towers of Chastity. Hidden behind ivy-covered walls and quiet courtyards, these places were not prisons by law, but by blood. The daughters locked inside were not criminals, but victims of reputation, silenced to preserve a family name. It began quietly, as most cruelties do. During the height of the Italian Renaissance, an age celebrated for beauty, intellect, and art, noble families faced a very different obsession: honor. A man's reputation was his currency, and his daughter's virtue was his vault. To lose it, even by rumor, meant disgrace, not just for the girl, but for generations to come. So fathers built towers. In Florence, Venice, and Siena, they rose like monuments of virtue, small, windowed structures on the edges of estates. Some were attached to palazzos. Others were separate stone keeps, with single iron doors and no escape. Inside them, daughters were locked away, their only crime being young, beautiful, and under the control of men terrified of scandal. The rooms were sparse: a wooden bed, a crucifix, a small barred window that let in a slice of light but no view of the world beyond. Meals were passed through narrow slots, words exchanged only in whispers through walls. One of the earliest recorded cases came from 15th century Ferrara. A merchant's daughter, Isabella d'Este, was said to have been confined after being seen walking alone with a court poet. Her father claimed it was for her protection, that the world outside was filled with sin. But servants later whispered she spent 6 years in isolation. Her letters burned before they ever left the house, and she was not alone. In Florence, noble families like the Pazzi, Medici, and Strozzi all kept secret chambers for daughters who disobeyed, some for refusing arranged marriages, others simply for being too curious. To free with laughter, to alive. The logic was always the same: better confined than defiled. Many of these towers were built with strange precision. Thick walls designed not only to protect, but to muffle sound. A woman could scream, cry, or pray, and the noise would never reach the street. Only the echo of her own voice kept her company. Some were allowed books, devotional texts, scriptures, and the lives of saints who had endured suffering in silence. Others were denied even that, left to measure the passing days by the light that crept across the stone floor. And though these towers were meant to preserve purity, they often became tombs. Disease thrived in confinement, depression hollowed minds. Some girls starved themselves in protest. Others went mad from loneliness. Yet in public, families spoke proudly. They claimed their daughters were devoted to reflection or under spiritual guidance. To the outside world, a locked door became a sign of honor, proof that chastity was being guarded. But beneath the mask of piety lay a horror that even time could not erase. One chronicler from Bologna in 1523 wrote of a tower found abandoned after a fire. Inside, they discovered bones, the remains of two women chained to a wall, still wearing rusted chastity belts. No one knew their names. The tower was quietly demolished, and no record remained of who built it. Not all were hidden away forever. Some women were released, often when a marriage alliance became possible. But freedom came at a cost. They returned pale, withdrawn, their voices faint from years of silence. Many went willingly into convents afterward, unable to face the noise and judgment of the world outside. The church itself played a complex role. Priests and confessors often justified these confinements as acts of moral discipline. Some even blessed the towers, sanctifying cruelty with scripture. The line between penance and punishment blurred completely. But in secret letters, one smuggled by servants, or written in the margins of prayer books, some women left behind fragments of their pain. One reads, "They call this virtue. I call it death with open eyes." By the 16th century, the practice had spread across several Italian regions, becoming part of an unspoken tradition among powerful families. The towers became symbols of control disguised as protection, of silence masquerading as virtue. And as the Renaissance world praised its artists, philosophers, and inventors for celebrating human freedom, thousands of women sat forgotten in darkness, their lives traded for reputation, their existence reduced to whispers behind locked doors. These chastity towers became prisons, not only of stone, but of memory. Even after they crumbled, their stories were buried, hidden behind the elegance of portraits, palaces, and the myth of an enlightened age. But every generation leaves traces, and in the margins of history, the voices of those women remain, faint, sorrowful, and defiant. They remind us that for every masterpiece painted in the Renaissance, there were unseen walls built in the name of control. And that's where the story truly begins, in the silence those walls kept. Somewhere deep in Tuscany, a document dated 1539 was found centuries later. A confession by a mason who helped construct one such Tordella virtue. He wrote, "I built the door thick, the window small, and I sealed the cracks with lime so no sound would escape. The girl inside cried not for food, but for the world she could no longer see." That tower belonged to the noble Visconti family, one of many that treated their daughter's freedom as a danger to bloodlines. The mason's words reveal something chilling. These prisons were not made out of anger, but routine. They were part of the architecture of control. Inside these towers, life became a performance of submission. Women were ordered to pray at dawn and dusk, to eat in silence, and to confess imagined sins to the priest through a slot in the wall. Some were forced to wear plain linen shifts, heads shaved as symbols of humility. Mirrors were forbidden, vanity was a sin, after all, and silence was sacred. A girl could spend years staring at her own reflection only in the polished surface of a bowl of water. But human minds don't stay still under confinement. Some began to speak to the walls, or to invisible friends. One anonymous woman wrote on the inside of her cell with charcoal, "If God listens, he must hear my voice through the stone." That voice was never meant to be found. But when her tower was later dismantled, workers discovered the message beneath layers of plaster, a quiet rebellion etched into silence. The cruelty wasn't always physical. It was psychological, a slow erosion of identity. A daughter would be called ungrateful, impure, a threat to honor, and eventually, even she began to believe it. By the 1500s, the practice had become so normalized that builders offered torti retiro, retirement, towers as part of noble estate plans. They marketed them as places of meditation for women. But inside, there was nothing holy about them. One account from 1571 tells of Lucretia Malatesta, who was locked away after rumors spread that she had smiled too warmly at a guest during a feast. Her father declared, "A smile can be a scandal." She spent 8 years in isolation. When she was finally freed, she refused to speak again. Witnesses described her eyes as bright but hollow, as though they looked only inward. Some women resisted in the only ways they could, through art, prayer, or secret writings. Fragments of poems were later discovered in monasteries, written in delicate script. "My cage has no bars, only walls of memory in rare cases. Servants took pity." There are records of one maid who smuggled letters out of a tower near Verona. In them, the prisoner, a girl named Bianca della Torre, begged for rescue. But when the maid was caught, both were punished. Bianca was chained, and the maid disappeared entirely. By the dawn of the 17th century, the church began to quietly discourage such confinements. Yet the practice didn't vanish overnight. Some towers were disguised as convents, where wayward daughters were hidden under vows of obedience. It was a transfer of prison, not an escape. The Renaissance painted itself as an era of rebirth, of humanism, enlightenment, and reason. But for these women, it was an age of burial. Their lives were spent behind frescoed walls that the world celebrated for beauty, never knowing that the cries of the forgotten echo beneath. Centuries later, historians began to uncover the truth. Diaries, letters, and estate records revealed how widespread the practice had been. Some families even documented the deaths of their daughters as peaceful passages to God, never admitting they had died alone, in silence. One historian described the remains found in a demolished tower outside Florence. A skeleton curled beneath a rosary, a small gold locket still clutched in bone fingers. Inside the locket, a strand of hair and the inscription Perdonami Padre, forgive me, Father. That phrase, forgiveness, captures the tragedy of the Chastity Towers. The women inside rarely hated their captors. They were raised to believe obedience was sacred, that silence was purity, and that suffering was the price of virtue. Their minds were molded to accept their imprisonment as holy duty, and that is what makes their stories so haunting, not the cruelty of their fathers, but the quiet acceptance of their own suffering. Today, in certain parts of Italy, small ruins stand in gardens and courtyards, narrow structures with sealed windows. Locals call them Del Ragazzi Mute, the silent girls' towers. Few tourists ever notice them. Most walk past, unaware that behind those stones once sat daughters who prayed for a world they would never see again. Their names are lost, but their silence remains carved into the stones of Renaissance history. A silence heavier than chains, because these towers were never just about purity. They were about power, about fear disguised as morality, about how society could turn control into virtue and call it love. And in remembering them, we tear down those walls once more, not with hands, but with truth. If you found this story as haunting as I did, share it, because silence protected the guilty for centuries, and by breaking it, we give voice to those who were never allowed to speak.